Sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can change everything. Sometimes protecting the innocent means facing the darkness you thought you'd left behind. In the frozen wilderness of Montana Territory, 62-year-old Jedediah Boone lives alone in his mountain cabin. The old bounty hunter traded his guns for solitude years ago, trying to forget the violent man he used to be. One bitter morning, he finds a pregnant donkey collapsed in the snow, beaten and abandoned by rancher Earl Haskins. Jed nurses the animal back to health, naming her Gracie. But when Haskins comes to take her back, something awakens in the old mountain man. This simple act of kindness becomes something much bigger. It forces Jed to face his past and decide what kind of man he really wants to be. What happens when a killer tries to become a protector? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air bit sharp as a blade when Jedediah Boone stepped onto his cabin porch, steam rising from the weathered tin cup cradled in his calloused hands. This cup, dented from countless mornings, blackened by years of campfire coffee, had been his constant companion for near 2 decades. It held more than coffee. It held ritual, routine, the quiet ceremonies that kept a man sane in the lonesome. The Montana Territory stretched before him like God's own cathedral, all snow-draped pines and granite peaks that pierced the pewter sky. February had settled deep into the bones of the land, and the cold carried that particular bite that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lungs. Jed pulled his woolen coat tighter, the same coat he'd worn through 3 winters now, patched at the elbows where the fabric had worn thin from leaning against split-rail fences and cabin walls. 62 years old, and every one of them etched into the lines around his eyes. His beard, more salt than pepper now, caught the morning frost as he sipped his coffee and watched the sun struggle through the cloud cover. This was his hour, this quiet time before the world stirred, when a man could think without the weight of yesterday's choices pressing down on his shoulders. The cabin behind him stood solid against the mountain wind, built by his own hands from pine logs he'd felled and shaped with care. It wasn't much. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a loft where he stored his winter provisions, but it was his. No badges to polish, no wanted posters to study, no horses to saddle in the pre-dawn dark. Just the mountain, the silence, and the ghosts that visited him in the small hours when sleep wouldn't come. Those ghosts wore familiar faces. Billy Crawford, who'd begged for his life behind the livery stable in Cheyenne. Martha Kellum, who'd drawn on him outside the Silver Dollar and died, with her hand still reaching for her derringer. 3 years he'd been retired from bounty hunting. 3 years since he'd hung up his guns and ridden into these mountains seeking something he couldn't name. Peace, maybe? Redemption, if such a thing existed for a man who'd made his living from other men's deaths. The coffee tasted bitter this morning, or maybe that was just the weight of memory. Jed had been good at his work, too good, some might say. They'd called him the Wolf of the Territories, and the name fit. He'd tracked men across 4 states, brought them in dead more often than alive, because dead men didn't try to shoot you in the back. The money had been good, the reputation useful, but somewhere along the way, he'd started seeing faces in his dreams. A sound from the woodpile caught his attention, a soft shuffling, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines. Jed set his cup on the porch rail and stepped down into the snow, his boots crunching through the crust that had formed overnight. Probably a raccoon or maybe a fox looking for scraps. He'd taken to leaving table scraps out for the wild creatures. Another small kindness that felt like penance. But as he rounded the corner of his cabin, what he saw froze him in place. A donkey lay collapsed against his woodpile, her sides heaving with labored breath. She was a small thing, maybe 14 hands, with a coat that should have been grey, but was matted with ice and mud. Her belly was swollen with pregnancy, and even from a distance, Jed could see the wounds on her flanks, fresh cuts that spoke of rope burns and worse. Easy there. Girl, he murmured, approaching slowly with his hands visible. The donkey's eyes rolled white with fear, but she was too weak to run. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd first thought. Someone had beaten this animal, and recently. The brand on her left flank told him everything he needed to know. A crude H burned deep into the hide. Earl Haskins. The name brought a taste like copper pennies to Jed's mouth. He'd crossed paths with Haskins twice in his bounty hunting days, once tracking a rustler who'd worked for the man, and another time when Haskins had tried to hire him to run off some homesteaders. Both times Jed had walked away with the distinct impression that Earl Haskins was the kind of man who enjoyed causing pain. The donkey shivered, and Jed made his decision. Whatever had happened here, whatever dispute had led to this animal being beaten and driven into the wilderness in the dead of winter, it wasn't her fault. He'd learned something in his years of solitude. Mercy was a choice, and it was often the hardest choice a man could make. "Come on, then," he said softly, working his arms under the donkey's belly. She weighed more than he'd expected, heavy with the life she carried, but Jed had always been strong. Years of hard living had carved muscle and sinew that age hadn't yet stolen. He carried her to his barn, really just a lean-to shed attached to the cabin, and laid her on a bed of fresh straw. The barn smelled of hay and leather, and hanging from a peg near the door was his old gun belt. He hadn't worn it in 3 years, but he'd kept it oiled and ready out of habit. The twin Colt .45s hung in their holsters like sleeping serpents. And for a moment, looking at the beaten animal before him, Jed felt the familiar itch in his gun hand, but that was the old Jed, the wolf. This was different. This was about healing, not hurting. He fetched water from the well, warming it over his fire until it steamed. Then came the careful work of cleaning the donkey's wounds, speaking to her in the same low, steady voice he'd once used to calm spooked horses. Her breathing gradually slowed, and she allowed him to work without struggle. "Gracie," he said aloud, surprising himself. The name had just come to him, soft and natural as sunrise. "That's what I'll call you, girl, Gracie." As if responding to her new name, the donkey turned her head toward him, and for a moment their eyes met. In her gaze, Jed saw something he recognized, the look of a creature that had known cruelty but hadn't given up hope. It was a look he'd seen in his own mirror more times than he cared to count. The morning passed in quiet work. He brought fresh hay from his small store, checked and rechecked her wounds, and sat with her as she dozed. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind of quiet understanding that came when two battered souls recognized each other. By noon, when the sun had climbed high enough to set the snow sparkling like scattered diamonds, Gracie was strong enough to take water from his cupped hands. Her dark eyes had lost some of their wildness, replaced by something that might have been trust. Jed found himself talking to her as he worked, telling her about the mountain, about the deer that came to drink from the creek in the evenings, about the way the aspens turned gold in autumn. It felt good to have something to talk to besides his own ghosts. "You're safe now," he told her, scratching behind her ears the way he remembered his father doing with their old mule back in Missouri. "Whatever happened before, it's done. You've got a home here as long as you need it." The words carried more weight than he'd intended. A home. When was the last time he'd thought of this place as anything more than a hideout, a retreat from the world and its demands? But looking at Gracie, seeing the way she'd begun to relax in his presence, Jed realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about saving an animal anymore. This was about remembering what it felt like to be needed, to have a purpose that didn't involve violence. As the afternoon wore on and shadows began to lengthen across the snow, Jed sat on an overturned bucket beside Gracie's makeshift stall, his tin cup once again warming his hands. The coffee tasted better now, less bitter somehow. The silence of the mountain felt less lonely with another heartbeat nearby, even if it belonged to a pregnant donkey with sad eyes and healing wounds. He thought about Earl Haskins, about the kind of man who would beat a pregnant animal and drive her into the wilderness to die. He thought about the brand on Gracie's flank and what it might mean if Haskins came looking for his property. The old instincts stirred, the careful planning, the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous work. But those thoughts felt different now, colored by something he'd almost forgotten. Not the cold calculation of a predator, but the fierce protectiveness of a guardian. He wasn't thinking about hunting anymore. He was thinking about protecting. Outside, the wind picked up, setting the pine boughs to singing their ancient song. Inside the barn, Gracie dozed peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. And sitting beside her, Jedediah Boone felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet satisfaction of doing something purely good. Without thought of payment or reputation or consequence, for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't running from his past. He was choosing his future, one small act of mercy at a time. Whatever came next, whatever reckoning might follow, he would face it as the man he wanted to be, not the man he'd been. The mountain held its breath, and in that silence, something like hope took root in the heart of an old wolf, learning to be gentle. 3 days had passed since Gracie's arrival, and the routine had settled into something that felt natural as breathing. Jed rose with the sun, heated water for her wounds, and spent his mornings in the barn, talking to her while she ate the hay he'd saved for his own horse. A horse he'd sold 2 years back, when the loneliness of the mountain had seemed like enough company. Gracie was healing well. Her wounds had scabbed over clean, and the spark in her dark eyes grew brighter each day. She'd taken to nickering softly when he approached, a sound that warmed him more than his morning coffee. The baby she carried was due soon. By his reckoning, her sides had dropped, and she'd grown restless, shifting from foot to foot in the way of expectant mothers everywhere. On this 4th morning, as snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes that promised a storm by evening, Jed heard something that made his blood run cold, the distant thunder of hoofbeats on the mountain trail. He set down his tin cup and stepped outside, his ears straining against the wind. There, the unmistakable sound of multiple horses picking their way up the narrow path that led to his cabin. Few people knew about this trail, and fewer still had reason to use it. In his 3 years of solitude, he'd seen maybe a handful of visitors, mostly lost trappers or the occasional territorial marshal on official business. But this felt different. This felt purposeful. Jed moved to the window that faced the trail and peered through the frost-etched glass. 4 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses breathing steam in the cold air. At the front rode a man Jed recognized even at a distance, Earl Haskins, bundled in an expensive fur coat that looked out of place in the rough country. Behind him rode 3 men that had the hard look of hired guns, their hands resting easy on the butts of their pistols despite the cold. A knot formed in Jed's stomach, tight as a hangman's noose. He'd known this moment might come, but hoping and knowing were different creatures entirely. Earl Haskins had come for his property, and he'd brought enough firepower to make his point clear. From the barn came a soft nicker. Gracie had heard the horses too. Animals always knew when trouble was riding toward them. Jed stood motionless for a long moment, watching the riders approach. He could feel the weight of his gun belt hanging in the barn, could almost feel the familiar grip of his Colts in his hands. 3 years of peace, 3 years of trying to forget the man he'd been. And now Earl Haskins was bringing it all back with the inevitability of winter. The riders pulled up in front of his cabin, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold. Haskins dismounted with the careful movements of a man who spent more time in offices than saddles, while his 3 companions stayed mounted, their eyes scanning the cabin and surrounding woods with professional wariness. Jed opened his door and stepped onto the porch, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. "Morning, Earl. Long way to ride in weather like this." Earl Haskins was a soft man gone to fat, with pale eyes that held all the warmth of February wind. He wore his wealth like armor, the expensive coat, the silver-inlaid spurs, the ivory-handled pistol at his hip that probably hadn't been fired outside of target practice. But wealth couldn't buy him the hardness that came from real violence, and Jed could see the nervous tension in the way he carried himself. "Boone," Haskins said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Figured I might find you up here. Word is, you've got something that belongs to me." "Don't recall borrowing anything from you, Earl." Haskins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. My prize Jenny went missing 3 nights ago. Tracked her up this way before the snow covered the trail. Now, I'm not saying you stole her, but I am saying she's mine by right of purchase and brand, and I mean to have her back." The 3 hired guns shifted in their saddles, and Jed recognized the type. Not gunfighters exactly, but hard men who do whatever Haskins paid them to do. The kind who'd burn a cabin to collect a debt or put a bullet in a man's back for the right price. Prize Jenny, you say? Jed kept his voice level, conversational. Must be worth a lot to bring 4 men up a mountain trail in a snowstorm. She's carrying a foal, sired by my best jack. Bloodline's worth more than this whole mountainside. Haskins gestured at the cabin with dismissive contempt. Now, you gonna bring her out, or do we need to come in and get her? From the barn came another soft nicker, and Jed saw Haskins' eyes sharpen with recognition. The sound hit Jed like a physical blow. Gracie was calling to him, trusting him to keep her safe. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "Animal's been beaten half to death," Jed said quietly. "Whoever did that to her ought to be ashamed. What I do with my property is my business." Haskins' voice carried an edge now, the thin veneer of politeness starting to crack. "She's a stubborn animal, needed correcting. Some creatures don't learn any other way." The casual cruelty in those words lit something hot and dangerous in Jed's chest. He thought of Gracie's wounds, of the terror in her eyes when he'd first found her, of the way she'd flinched when he'd reached out to touch her. Prized Jenny, as if her only value lay in what she could produce, what profit she could generate. Maybe she had good reason to be stubborn, Jed said. One of the hired guns, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Boss, we're burning daylight here. Storm's coming in, and I don't fancy being caught on this mountain in a blizzard." Haskins nodded curtly. "You're right, Dutch. Boone, I'm done being polite. That animal belongs to me, and I'm taking her. You can step aside peaceful-like, or we can do this the hard way. But either way, I'm leaving with my property." Jed felt the old familiar calm settling over him, the cold clarity that had made him so effective in his hunting days. Time seemed to slow, and he became acutely aware of every detail, the wind direction, the positioning of the riders, the distance to his barn where his guns waited. His hands hung loose at his sides, ready. "She's not property," he said quietly. "She's a living creature that's been hurt and scared and left to die. And she's under my protection now." Haskins laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "Your protection? You're one old man against 4 armed riders. What kind of protection is that? The permanent kind?" The words came out colder than the mountain air, carrying the weight of 15 years spent tracking dangerous men across dangerous country. For just a moment, Haskins seemed to really see him. Not a hermit or a recluse, but something far more dangerous. Recognition flickered in his pale eyes. "I know you," Haskins said slowly. "You're that bounty hunter. The one they called—" "That was a long time ago," Jed cut him off. "I'm retired. Are you?" Dutch had drawn his pistol, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "Because you're starting to sound like a man who's fixing to make trouble." From inside the barn came a new sound, a low, pained bellow that made Jed's blood freeze. Gracie was in labor, and the sound of raised voices had frightened her. The foal was coming, here and now, while her owner stood in the snow demanding her return. "Hear that?" Jed said, his voice carrying across the yard like winter wind. "That's new life trying to come into the world. And I'll be damned if I let you take it before it's even drawn breath." Haskins' face flushed red above his expensive coat. "That fall is mine too. Every breath it takes, every step it makes, mine. Now get out of my way, old man, before I have my boys drag you out of it." The moment stretched tight as a bowstring. 4 men against 1, odds that would have made a younger Jed smile with anticipation. But this wasn't about the odds anymore. This was about the choice between the man he'd been and the man he wanted to become. Another bellow from the barn decided it for him. "No," Jed said simply. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and final as a blade. Haskins's hand moved toward his ivory-handled pistol, and his 3 men tensed in their saddles. The storm was coming, and not just from the darkening sky. Jedediah Boone, the wolf of the territories, was about to remember why they'd called him that. The silence stretched like ice about to crack. Jed could feel the weight of 4 pairs of eyes on him, measuring, calculating. Behind him, the barn door stood slightly ajar, and beyond it lay his gun belt hanging on its peg, close enough to reach, but not without turning his back on armed men. Dutch shifted in his saddle, leather creaking in the cold. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Haskins snapped, his pale eyes never leaving Jed's face. "I want to hear what our retired bounty hunter has to say for himself. You figure you can take all 4 of us, Boone?" Jed considered the question seriously, the way he might consider the weather or the lay of the land. It was a tactical problem, nothing more. 4 men, 3 still mounted, 1 on foot. Dutch looked like he knew his business. The scar on his cheek and the easy way he held his pistol spoke of experience. The other 2 were harder to read, but they had the wolfish alertness of men who'd seen violence. "Don't need to take all 4, Jed said finally. "Just need to take you." The words hit Haskins like a slap. His face went from red to white, and his hand moved instinctively toward his ivory-handled pistol before stopping. Even a soft man could recognize a threat when it was laid out plain. Another bellow from the barn cut through the tension, this one weaker, more pained. Gracie was struggling, and every instinct Jed had developed over 3 years of caring for wounded creatures told him she needed help. The foal was trying to come, but something wasn't right. "I need to tend to her," Jed said, taking a step toward the barn. "You're not going anywhere," Dutch growled. Raising his pistol, Jed stopped, his eyes fixed on the hired gun. "That animal is in labor. She could die, and the foal with her. That what you want on your conscience?" "Don't have much of a conscience," Dutch replied, but there was something uncertain in his voice now. "Makes the work easier." "Maybe," Jed said, "but you strike me as the practical type. Dead animals don't make money. And if that foal dies because you kept me from helping, Haskins here loses a prized bloodline. That the kind of practical thinking your boss is paying you for?" Haskins' jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. The calculation was written plain on his face: profit and loss, investment and return. A dead Jenny and foal were worth nothing to him, but admitting Jed was right meant backing down. And backing down in front of hired guns was dangerous for a man like Earl Haskins. "You've got 5 minutes, Haskins said finally. "And tend to her quick, then we're taking them both." Jed nodded and moved toward the barn, acutely aware of the guns trained on his back. Every step felt like walking through water, time stretching and compressing in the strange way it did when violence hung in the air like smoke. Inside the barn, Gracie lay on her side in the straw, her breathing shallow and rapid. The contractions were coming hard, but something was wrong with the presentation. Jed had helped birth enough foals in his younger days to recognize the signs. The baby was turned wrong, trying to come out backward. "Easy, girl," he murmured, kneeling beside her in the straw. His hands moved with practiced gentleness, feeling for the foal's position. Gracie's eyes rolled white with pain and fear, but she didn't fight him. The trust she'd placed in him over the past 3 days held, even now. From outside came the muffled voices of Haskins and his men, arguing in low tones about something. Jed tried to block them out, focusing all his attention on Gracie and the life she was struggling to bring into the world. The foal was definitely breached, back legs first, instead of front. In the wild, this would likely mean death for both mother and baby. But Jed's hands remembered what to do, guided by years of experience and something deeper, the same gentle strength that had drawn wounded creatures to him throughout his years in these mountains. "Come on, little one," he whispered, working carefully to turn the foal. "Your mama's been through enough. Time to make this easy on her," Gracie groaned, a sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. Her breathing was getting shallower, and Jed could see exhaustion taking its toll. She'd been weakened by her ordeal with Haskins, and this difficult birth was pushing her to the edge of her strength. Outside, Haskins' voice rose sharply. 5 minutes, I said. "How long does it take to birth a—" His words were cut off by another voice, one Jed didn't recognize. A 5th rider had arrived, and from the tone of the conversation, this wasn't part of Haskins's original plan. Jed forced himself to ignore the voices, concentrating on the delicate work of turning the foal. One wrong move could injure or kill both animals, but doing nothing guaranteed the same result. His hands moved with infinite care, feeling for the tiny hooves, the fragile legs. There, he felt the shift as the foal began to turn. Gracie's body seemed to understand what was happening, and she pushed with renewed strength. Slowly, carefully, the baby began to emerge properly. The barn door creaked open, and Dutch stepped inside, his pistol drawn but pointed at the ground. "Boss wants to know what's taking so long." "Almost there," Jed said without looking up. Another few minutes. Dutch moved closer, and Jed could feel the man's eyes on him. "You really used to be a bounty hunter?" "Long time ago. Heard stories about a man they called the Wolf. Said he could track a whisper across solid rock, and his draw was faster than chain lightning." Jed's hands never stopped their gentle work. "Stories get exaggerated, maybe, but the way you faced down 4 armed men without blinking, that wasn't exaggerated. That was real." Gracie pushed again, harder this time, and the foal slipped free in a rush of fluid and membrane. It was tiny, perfect, and very much alive, a little Jenny with her mother's dark coat and bright, alert eyes. She shook her head once, then struggled to her feet with the determined wobbliness of all newborns. "Well, I'll be damned," Dutch said softly. "Look at that little thing." For a moment the violence outside seemed very far away. In the warm, hay-scented barn, a new life had entered the world, and the ancient miracle of birth made everything else seem small and petty by comparison. Gracie turned her head to nuzzle her baby, and the little foal immediately began searching for milk. The bond between them was instant and fierce, mother and child, protector and protected. "Beautiful thing, birth," Dutch said, holstering his pistol. "My wife had 3 babies. Never got old watching them come into the world." Jed looked up at the hired gun, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not just a weapon in Haskins' employ, but a man with a wife. A father who'd watched his own children take their first breaths. "Still got that family?" Jed asked. Dutch's face clouded. "Fever took them 2 winters back. All 3 at once. That's when I started writing for men like Haskins." The pain in the man's voice was raw and real. Jed understood. He'd seen enough broken men to recognize one when he met him. Dutch wasn't evil, just lost, trying to fill the hole where his family used to be with violence and whiskey and the cold comfort of other men's money. Outside, Haskins' voice grew sharper, more demanding. The moment of peace was ending, and the reckoning was at hand. But something had changed in that barn, something that might matter when the shooting started. 2 damaged men had watched new life come into the world, and both had remembered what it felt like to be human. The barn door slammed open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Earl Haskins stood framed in the doorway, his expensive coat dusted with snow and his pale eyes burning with impatience. Behind him loomed 2 of his remaining men. The third had apparently stayed with the horses. "Time's up, Boone," Haskins snarled, then stopped short when he saw the scene before him. Gracie lay in the straw, cleaning her newborn daughter with long, gentle strokes of her tongue. The little foal stood on unsteady legs, already nursing with the fierce determination of the very young. For a moment, something flickered across Haskins' face. Surprise, maybe even wonder. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that seemed to drive every decision he made. Well, he said, stepping into the barn. "Looks like my investment just doubled. That's a fine-looking filly." Dutch shifted uncomfortably beside his boss, his eyes fixed on the newborn. "Boss, maybe we should..." "Should what?" Haskins cut him off. "Should walk away from valuable livestock because it's cute. This is business, Dutch, nothing personal." Jed rose slowly from his crouch beside Gracie, his movements deliberate and unthreatening despite the rage building in his chest. "She just gave birth. They need time to bond, to recover. Moving them now could kill them both. My property, my decision." Haskins pulled a leather folder from inside his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. "Bill of sale, dated 6 months ago, when Grey Jenny bred to a prize jack. Legal and binding." The paper looked genuine enough, but Jed had seen enough forged documents in his bounty hunting days to know that money could buy almost any kind of official paperwork. Still, the law was the law. even out here in the territories where civilization wore thin as mountain air. Even if that's legitimate, Jed said carefully. Moving a newborn foal in this weather is a death sentence. You'll lose them both. Haskins folded the document and slipped it back into his coat. Then I guess we'll winter here until they're strong enough to travel. The words hit Jed like a physical blow. The thought of Earl Haskins and his hired guns taking over his sanctuary, his place of peace, filled him with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. 3 years he'd lived here alone. 3 years of quiet mornings and healing solitude, and now this soft, cruel man wanted to strip it all away. "This is my land," Jed said quietly. "Is it?" Haskins smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "You got a deed, old man? Any legal claim to this mountainside? Because according to territorial records, this whole area is unsurveyed public land. Anyone can stake a claim." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Jed's mind. This wasn't just about recovering stolen property. Haskins wanted the land itself. The mountain held timber, fresh water, and grazing rights that could be worth a fortune to the right man. The donkey had just been an excuse, a legal reason to come up here with armed men. "You planned this," Jed said. "I plan everything." Haskins gestured toward the cabin visible through the barn door. "Nice little setup you've got here. Good water, defensible position, enough timber to supply half the territory. Be a shame to let it go to waste on one old hermit." Dutch was looking between his boss and Jed with growing unease. "Boss, this ain't what we discussed. You said we were just collecting livestock. Plans change," Haskins snapped. "You're getting paid to follow orders, not ask questions." The fifth voice Jed had heard earlier spoke up from outside the barn. "Actually, Earl, I think Dutch here's got a point." A new figure appeared in the doorway, a woman in her 50s, tall and weathered, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a man's coat and trousers, and her boots were caked with the same mountain mud that spoke of hard travel. But it was her eyes that caught Jed's attention, sharp, intelligent, and thoroughly unimpressed with Earl Haskins. "Mary Catherine," Haskins said, his voice tight with sudden nervousness. "What are you doing here?" "Following my wayward livestock, same as you." The woman stepped into the barn, her gaze moving from Gracie to her foal to Jed himself. "Though I'm starting to think we've got different ideas about what that means." Jed felt a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The newcomer's presence had changed the dynamic in ways he didn't yet understand. But Dutch and the other hired gun were both relaxing slightly, their hands moving away from their weapons. "Ma'am," Jed said, touching the brim of his hat. "Jedediah Boone." "Mary Catherine Sullivan," she replied with a brief nod. "And that there's my Jenny and her baby." The words hung in the cold air like icicles about to fall. Haskins's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, anger, and finally a kind of sick understanding. "Your Jenny," he said weakly. Mary Catherine reached into her own coat and produced a document that looked considerably more worn and authentic than Haskins' pristine bill of sale. "Gracie here was stolen from my ranch 2 weeks ago. I've been tracking her ever since." Jed felt something like relief wash over him, followed immediately by caution. If Mary Catherine was Gracie's rightful owner, what did that mean for the little family he'd grown so protective of? One look at the woman's face told him she was cut from different cloth than Earl Haskins. There was kindness there, tempered by the kind of strength that came from years of hard living. "You have proof of ownership?" Jed asked. Mary Catherine handed him the document. It was a registration paper from the Colorado Territory, complete with detailed descriptions of Gracie's markings and bloodline. More importantly, it was dated 3 years earlier, well before Haskins' alleged purchase. "She's my foundation mare," Mary Catherine said, moving slowly toward Gracie and her foal. "Been trying to build a breeding program with hardy mountain stock. Gracie here's got bloodlines that go back to the Spanish conquistadors." Haskins' jaw worked like he was chewing glass. "That's impossible." "I bought her fair and square from Jake Morrison, I'd guess," Mary Catherine finished. "Jake's been running stolen livestock through these mountains for months. Territorial marshals are closing in on him. which is probably why he was so eager to sell. The hired gun who'd stayed outside finally spoke up. "Boss, if the animal's stolen, we can't—" "Shut up!" Haskins snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "I don't care who owns what. I came up here for livestock, and I'm not leaving empty-handed." His hand moved toward the ivory-handled pistol at his hip, and Jed felt the familiar cold clarity settling over him again. The moment of reckoning had arrived, but now the stakes were different. It wasn't just about protecting Gracie anymore. It was about protecting Mary Catherine, too, and the newborn foal that deserved a chance to grow up free from the violence of men like Earl Haskins. 3 years of peace were about to end in gunsmoke and blood, and Jedediah Boone found himself ready for the storm. The barn fell silent, except for the soft sounds of the newborn foal nursing and the whisper of wind through the gaps in the weathered boards. Haskins' hand hovered over his pistol grip, his pale eyes darting between Jed and Mary Catherine like a cornered animal looking for an escape route. Dutch cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Boss, maybe we should talk about this outside." "There's nothing to talk about," Haskins snapped, but his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "I've got a bill of sale, and that makes this my livestock." Mary Catherine stepped closer to Gracie, her movements calm and deliberate. The Jenny recognized her immediately, nickering softly and trying to rise. Mary Catherine placed a gentle hand on her neck, whispering words of comfort in what sounded like Irish Gaelic. "Easy, Mo Store," she murmured. "You're safe now." Watching the reunion, Jed felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Gracie had found her way back to someone who clearly loved her, but also a sharp pang of loss. For 3 days he'd been needed, responsible for another living creature's well-being. The purpose had filled a hole in his life he hadn't even known existed. "Your Jenny's been through hell," he told Mary Catherine quietly, "beaten, driven into the mountains to die. If I hadn't found her when I did—" "I know." Mary Catherine's voice was steady, but her eyes blazed with quiet fury as she examined Gracie's healing wounds. "Jake Morrison had her for 2 weeks before he sold her to your friend here." 2 weeks of trying to break her spirit," Haskins laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Break her spirit? She's a dumb animal. She doesn't have a spirit to break." The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Jed felt the old familiar coldness settling over him, the same icy calm that had made him so effective at hunting dangerous men. His hands hung loose at his sides, deceptively relaxed. "A man who'd say that about any living creature," Jed said quietly, "isn't much of a man at all." The hired gun beside Dutch, a younger man with nervous eyes, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Boss, the storm's getting worse. We should head back before the trail gets blocked." Through the barn door, they could all see the snow falling heavier now, fat flakes that spoke of a serious mountain blizzard building. The kind of storm that could trap travelers for days, or kill them if they were caught in the open. "We're not going anywhere without my property," Haskins said. But there was desperation creeping into his voice now. His carefully laid plans were unraveling, and men like Earl Haskins didn't handle setbacks well. Mary Catherine stood slowly, her hand still resting on Gracie's neck. "Mr. Haskins, is it? I'm going to make you an offer, and I suggest you take it. I don't negotiate with thieves. The only thief here is the man you bought stolen goods from." Mary Catherine's voice remained level, but there was iron underneath the words. "My offer is this. You and your boys ride out now, and we'll call this a misunderstanding. Nobody gets hurt, nobody goes to jail, and you can tell folks you decided to be reasonable." Haskins' face flushed red above his expensive coat. "And if I don't?" Mary Catherine glanced at Jed, and he saw something in her eyes that spoke of shared understanding. She'd recognized what he was, just as he'd recognized the steel in her. They were both people who'd learned to handle trouble when it came calling. "Then Mr. Boone here, and I will have to insist," she said simply. The younger hired gun was looking more nervous by the minute. "Boss, maybe she's right. Storm's getting bad, and if this really is stolen livestock—" "It's not stolen!" Haskins exploded. "I have a bill of sale." "From a known rustler," Mary Catherine pointed out. "That paper isn't worth the ink it's printed with, and you know it. Dutch spoke up for the first time in several minutes. She's got a point, boss. Jake Morrison's been running hot horses through 3 territories. If the marshals catch up with this, the marshals aren't here, Haskins snarled. It's just one old bounty hunter and a woman who thinks she can intimidate me with legal papers. He was losing control of his men, and Jed could see it in the way they avoided his eyes, the nervous glances they exchanged. Fear was a funny thing. It could make men do stupid things, or it could make them smart enough to walk away from a bad situation. Your boys seem like reasonable men, Jed observed. Smart enough to know when a job's gone sideways. They work for me, Haskins snapped. For money, Dutch corrected quietly. And dead men don't spend money. The words hit like a slap. Haskins spun toward his hired gun, his hand moving instinctively toward his pistol. Are you threatening me? No, boss. Just stating facts. Dutch's own hand was nowhere near his weapon, but his posture had shifted subtly. He was ready to move, but not necessarily in the direction Haskins expected. In the straw beside them, Gracie's foal finished nursing and curled up against her mother's warmth. The little creature was completely oblivious to the tension filling the barn, concerned only with the simple needs of warmth, food, and safety. Looking at her, Jed felt something shift inside him, not the cold calculation of the wolf, but the fierce protectiveness of a guardian. Here's how this is going to work, Jed said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down dozens of dangerous situations. Mrs. Sullivan is taking her animals home. You boys are riding back down the mountain before this storm gets any worse. And Mr. Haskins here is going to consider himself lucky that nobody's pressing charges for receiving stolen goods. And if I refuse? Haskins' voice was shrill now, all pretense of control abandoned. Jed looked at him for a long moment, really seeing him not as a threat or an opponent, but as a frightened, greedy man who'd gotten in over his head. The pity he felt surprised him. Then you'll discover why they used to call me the Wolf, Jed said quietly. The temperature in the barn seemed to drop 10 degrees. Even Mary Catherine, who'd been standing her ground admirably, took a small step back. The younger hired gun's face went pale, and Dutch's hand moved unconsciously toward his pistol grip before stopping. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and the snow fell heavier. The storm was building towards something serious, and everyone in the barn knew it. Decisions made in the next few minutes would determine who lived through the night and who didn't. Earl Haskins stood at the crossroads of his own making, and Jedediah Boone waited to see which path he would choose. The wind outside had grown from a whisper to a howl, rattling the barn walls and sending snow spiraling through every crack and gap. Through the open door, the world beyond was disappearing, into a wall of white that spoke of a true mountain. Blizzard, the kind that could bury a man alive or freeze him solid before. Morning, Earl Haskins stood frozen in the center of the barn, his expensive coat looking suddenly inadequate against the cold reality closing in around them all. His pale eyes darted from face to face, searching for support that wasn't there. Even his hired guns were looking more concerned with survival than loyalty. Boss, the younger man said, his voice tight with worry, we need to make a decision. Trail's going to be impossible soon. Dutch nodded grimly. Boy's right. I've seen storms like this before. We stay much longer. We'll be here till spring. Mary Catherine moved closer to Gracie and her foal, her practiced eye assessing their condition. They can't be moved tonight anyway, she said firmly. Baby's too young and Gracie needs more recovery time. Then we wait, Haskins declared, but his voice lacked conviction. All of us, together, the suggestion hung in the air like a bad smell. 5 armed adults trapped in a mountain cabin during a blizzard, with conflicting claims and wounded pride between them. Jed had seen enough violence to know how quickly close quarters could turn deadly. That's not going to work, he said quietly. Why not? Haskins demanded. It's a big enough cabin. We can all fit. Jed studied the man's face, seeing the desperation there. Haskins was trapped by his own greed and stubbornness, unable to back down, but smart enough to realize he was in over his head. A dangerous combination, because you're not going to let this go, Jed said. Come morning, you'll still think you own these animals. And sooner or later, that's going to lead to shooting. Dutch surprised everyone by holstering his pistol completely. Maybe it doesn't have to. All eyes turned to the scarred gunman. He looked older in the lamplight, weathered by years of hard living and harder choices. When he spoke, it was with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned to think before he acted. I got 3 kids at home, he said slowly. Well, had 3 kids. They're gone now, but I remember what it was like, worrying about keeping them fed and warm. That little foal there, she's somebody's baby too. And her mama's been through enough. Haskins' face darkened. I'm paying you to do a job, Dutch interrupted. But the job's changed. You said we were collecting stolen livestock from a thief. Turns out the thief was the man who sold them to you. The younger hired gun nodded agreement. Dutch is right, boss. This ain't what we signed on for. Jed watched the dynamics shift in the barn, feeling the familiar satisfaction of seeing a bad situation diffuse itself. Sometimes the best weapon was patience, letting other people's better angels win out over their worse impulses. Mary Catherine had been quiet during the exchange, but now she spoke up. Mr. Haskins, you seem like a businessman. Let me make you a business proposition. Haskins laughed bitterly. What could you possibly offer me? Information. Mary Catherine's voice carried the confidence of someone holding winning cards. See, I've been tracking Jake Morrison for weeks. I know where his operation is, who's working with him, and which ranchers have been buying his stolen stock. The barn fell silent, except for the storm outside. Even Haskins seemed to grasp the implications. Morrison's got friends in the territorial government, Mary Catherine continued. People who've been looking the other way for a cut of the profits. But the federal marshals are closing in, and when they make their move, a lot of important people are going to fall. What's that got to do with me? Haskins asked, but his voice was strained. Depends. You want to be one of the names on their list of buyers, or do you want to be the concerned citizen who helped bring them down? Jed felt a grudging admiration for Mary Catherine's tactics. She was offering Haskins a way to save face while doing the right thing. Always the best approach when dealing with proud, stubborn men. You're talking about turning witness against Morrison, Haskins said slowly. I'm talking about justice and smart business. Mary Catherine moved to the barn door, looking out at the swirling snow. Storm's getting worse. You boys need to make a choice soon. The younger hired gun was already moving toward the door. I'm not dying on this mountain for any amount of money. Boss, I'm riding out while I still can. Dutch looked torn, his eyes moving between his employer and the door. Boss, go, Haskins said wearily. Both of you, take your money and go. The 2 men didn't need to be told twice. They gathered their gear and headed for their horses, disappearing into the swirling white within moments. The sound of hoofbeats faded quickly, swallowed by the storm. Haskins stood alone now, his expensive coat hanging loose on his shoulders like a costume that no longer fit. Without his hired guns, he looked smaller, older, more like what he really was, a frightened man who'd gotten in over his head. So what now? He asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jed considered the question. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of winter unleashed. Inside, a newborn foal slept peacefully beside her mother, unaware of the human drama that had swirled around her birth. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Now you make a choice, Jed said. Same choice we all make every day. What kind of man do you want to be? Haskins was quiet for a long moment, staring at Gracie and her baby. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from deep in his bones. I used to have dreams, he said. When I was young, I wanted to build something. A ranch, a legacy, something that would outlast me. He gestured at his expensive clothes, his ivory-handled pistol. Instead, I built this. Money and fear and men with guns. Mary Catherine's voice was gentle when she replied. It's not too late to build something different, isn't it? Haskins looked up at them, and for the first time, Jed saw something human in his pale eyes. I've done things. Hurt people. Destroyed lives for profit. We've all done things, Jed said quietly, thinking of his own ghosts. Question is what we do next. Outside, the storm reached its full fury, sealing them all inside the small circle of lamplight and warmth. But inside the barn, something like hope was taking root in the space between what they'd been and what they might yet become. The storm had been raging for 3 hours when they heard the gunshots, 3 sharp cracks echoing through the howling wind, followed by the distant sound of horses screaming in pain and terror. Jed was on his feet instantly, his hand moving toward the gun belt that still hung in the barn. "That came from down the trail," Mary Catherine said, her face pale in the lamplight. Haskins looked stricken. Dutch and the boy, they must have gotten caught in the storm. But Jed was already moving, his mind racing through possibilities. Those hadn't been random shots. They'd been deliberate, spaced apart like a man taking careful aim. And the horses screaming afterward that spoke of wounded animals, not dead ones. "Someone's out there," he said grimly, strapping on his gun belt for the first time in 3 years. The weight of the twin Colts felt familiar and strange at the same time, like greeting an old friend you weren't sure you wanted to see in this storm. Mary Catherine shook her head. Nobody would be crazy enough to... Her words were cut off by the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside the barn. Slow, deliberate steps that spoke of someone taking their time, unworried about stealth or surprise. Jed motioned for silence and moved to the small window that looked out toward the cabin. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure was approaching through the swirling snow, tall, lean, wearing a long coat that hung open despite the frigid wind. Even at a distance and through the storm, Jed recognized the walk, the casual confidence of a predator who knew he was in control. "Jesus," he whispered. "What is it?" Mary Catherine asked. "Trouble." Jed checked his pistols automatically, muscle memory taking over. "Bad trouble." The figure stopped 20 yards from the barn and called out, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. "Hello, Jed. Been a long time, old friend." Jed closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 15 years settling on his shoulders like a stone. He'd known this day might come eventually, but he'd hoped, prayed even, that it never would. "Who is that?" Haskins demanded. "Marcus Caney," Jed said quietly. "Best tracker in the territories. Maybe the best who ever lived." Mary Catherine's face went white. "The bounty hunter. But I thought he was dead." "So did I." Jed moved away from the window, his mind racing. "So did everyone else. Marcus Caney, the ghost of Colorado, they'd called him. The one man who could track the wolf, who'd come close to killing Jed twice in the early days, before they'd developed a grudging respect for each other's skills. Jed had heard he died in a shootout in Denver 3 years ago, the same year Jed had retired to these mountains. "Jed," Caney called again. "I know you're in there! Come out and let's talk like civilized men." "What does he want?" Mary Catherine whispered. Jed thought about the question, running through everything he knew about Marcus Kane. The man was methodical, patient, and absolutely ruthless when it came to completing a job. He didn't make social calls, especially not in the middle of a mountain blizzard. "He's here for me," Jed said finally. "Has to be. Question is why, after all this time?" Haskins was looking between them with growing panic. "You mean he followed us up here? But how did he even know?" He stopped mid-sentence, understanding dawning on his pale face. "The horses. Dutch and the boy. He shot their horses to trap them. To get information." The realization hit Jed like a physical blow. Caney hadn't stumbled onto them by accident. He'd been tracking them, probably for days, waiting for the right moment to make his move. The storm provided perfect cover. No witnesses, no escape, and no law within 100 miles. "They're dead, aren't they?" Mary Catherine asked quietly. "Dutch and the young one," Jed nodded grimly. Marcus Caney didn't leave loose ends, and he had no use for hired guns who couldn't tell him what he needed to know. "Jed." Caney's voice was closer now, maybe 10 yards from the barn. "I'm going to count to 10, and then I'm coming in. We can do this easy or hard, but either way, we're going to have our conversation." "Stay back," Jed told Mary Catherine and Haskins. "Whatever happens, keep away from the door. What are you going to do?" Mary Catherine demanded. Jed checked his guns one more time, then moved toward the barn door. "What I should have done 3 years ago, which is finish it." The wind died for a moment, creating a pocket of eerie silence around the barn. In that silence, Jed could hear his own heartbeat, steady and slow despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was what he'd been good at, the moment before violence, when everything slowed down and the world became crystal clear. "One," Caney called out. Jed thought about the path that had led him here. 15 years of hunting dangerous men, 15 years of violence and death and the slow corruption of his soul. He'd tried to leave it behind, to find peace in these mountains, but the past had a way of finding a man, no matter how far he ran. "Two!" Behind him, Gracie stirred in the straw, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. Her foal slept peacefully beside her, still unnamed, still innocent of the violence that swirled around her birth. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, Jed was determined that they would survive. 3. Mary Catherine moved closer to the animals, positioning herself between them and the door. Haskins pressed himself against the far wall, his ivory-handled pistol forgotten in his terror. The man had never been in a real gunfight, and it showed. 4. Jed's hands hung loose at his sides, ready. The old instincts were flooding back, the way Caney moved, the rhythm of his speech, the subtle tells that every gunfighter developed over years of deadly encounters. Marcus Caney was good, maybe the best Jed had ever faced, but he had one weakness. He enjoyed the hunt too much to end it quickly. 5. The wind picked up again, howling through the barn walls, like the voices of all the men Jed had killed. 15 years of ghosts, and now they were coming home to roost. 6. But something had changed in those 3 years of solitude. The wolf had learned to be gentle, to care for wounded creatures, to find purpose in healing rather than hurting. The question was whether that gentleness had made him weak, or if it had made him stronger. 7. Jed thought about the morning coffee ritual, about the peace he'd found in simple routines. He thought about Gracie's trust, about the way she'd looked at him when he'd cleaned her wounds and brought her food. He thought about the choice between the man he'd been and the man he wanted to be. 8. Mary Catherine caught his eye and nodded once, a gesture of understanding and support. She knew what was coming, knew what kind of man Marcus Caney was. But she also seemed to understand that sometimes violence was the only way to protect the innocent. 9. Jed drew both pistols in one smooth motion, the muscle memory of 1,000 practice sessions taking over. The weight felt right in his hands, familiar as breathing. The wolf of the territories was about to remember why they'd given him that name. 10! The barn door exploded inward, and Marcus Caney stepped through the opening like death himself come calling. He was exactly as Jed remembered, tall, lean, with pale eyes that seemed to see everything and forgive nothing. His guns were already drawn, held with the casual competence of a master craftsman. "Hello, Jed," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Time to settle an old debt." Time seemed to stretch like taffy in the lamplight of the barn. Marcus Caney stood framed in the doorway, snow swirling around him like a devil's halo, his pale eyes fixed on Jed with the intensity of a man who'd been waiting years for this moment. 3 years, Caney said conversationally, not bothering to raise his voice above the storm. 3 years I've been tracking you, Jed. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find a man who doesn't want to be found? Jed's guns remained steady in his hands, barrels pointed at the floor, but ready to rise in a heartbeat. Hard enough that most men would have given up. Most men aren't me. Caney stepped fully into the barn, his boots crunching on the scattered straw. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step calculated and sure. Besides, I had help. Amazing what people will tell you when you ask the right questions, in the right way. Behind Jed, Mary Catherine stood protectively over Gracie and her foal, her hand resting on a pitchfork she'd taken from the wall. Haskins cowered against the far corner, his face white as the snow outside. The man's ivory-handled pistol might as well have been decorative for all the good it would do him. "Dutch and the boy," Jed said quietly. "They told you where to find me, eventually." Caney's smile was cold as winter wind. The young one broke first. Couldn't handle the questions. Dutch lasted longer, tough old bird, that one. But everyone breaks eventually. It's just a matter of finding the right pressure point. Jed felt something twist in his gut. 2 men were dead because of him, because of choices he'd made 15 years ago. The weight of their death settled on his shoulders, alongside all the others. What do you want, Marcus? What I've always wanted. To finish what we started in Dodge City. The words brought it all back. The dusty street, the crowd of onlookers. The moment when 2 of the fastest guns in the territories had faced each other over a bounty that had gone wrong. They'd both drawn, both fired, and both missed by margins so slim that witnesses argued about it for years afterward. It was the only time in either man's career that a showdown had ended without bloodshed. That was a long time ago, Jed said. Not long enough. Caney's eyes never left Jed's face, reading every micro-expression, every tell. You embarrassed me that day. Made me look weak in front of half the territory. Do you know what that did to my reputation? I know what it did to mine. Jed's voice was steady, but inside, the old memories were stirring. The fear, the adrenaline, the terrible clarity that came just before a killing. We both walked away. That should have been enough. Should have been. Caney shifted his weight slightly, a movement so subtle that only another gunfighter would have noticed. But then you retired. Disappeared into these mountains like some kind of hermit. Left me with nothing but half a legend and the knowledge that the one man who could match me was still out there. Mary Catherine spoke up for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. This is insane. You're talking about killing a man over wounded pride. Caney turned his pale gaze on her, and Mary Catherine took an involuntary step back. There was something inhuman in those eyes, something that had been carved out by years of violence and death. Pride? Caney laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Lady, this isn't about pride. This is about completion. About finishing something that should have been settled years ago. It is settled, Jed said firmly. We both walked away. We both chose to live. You chose to live. Caney's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. I chose to wait, to plan, to make sure that when we met again, there would be no crowd, no witnesses, no chance for another draw. The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. Caney hadn't just tracked him here. He'd orchestrated this entire encounter. The storm, the isolation, even Haskins' presence. It was all part of an elaborate plan to create the perfect killing ground. You knew about Gracie, Jed said, understanding dawning. About Haskins, about Mary Catherine. You've been watching for weeks. Months. Caney's smile was genuinely proud now, like an artist discussing his masterpiece. I needed you invested, you see. Needed you to care about something again, so you'd be motivated to fight. A man with nothing to lose is dangerous, but a man with something to protect, that's a man who makes mistakes. Mary Catherine's face went white with understanding. You manipulated all of this. The stolen animals, Haskins buying them, even my tracking them here. Not all of it, Caney admitted. I can't control everything, but I can recognize opportunities when they present themselves. When I heard that a certain mountain hermit had taken in a wounded donkey, I knew it was time to set things in motion. Jed felt the walls of the trap closing around him. Caney had used his own compassion against him, turned his attempt at redemption into a weapon. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He'd tried to save one life, and it might cost him everything. So, what's the play? Jed asked, his gun still steady in his hands. We step outside, count 10 paces, and settle this like it's 1875? Nothing so formal. Caney's eyes glittered with anticipation. Just 2 men, 2 guns, and the truth we've both been avoiding for 3 years. You're not a hermit, Jed. You're not a healer or a protector or whatever you've been telling yourself. You're a killer, same as me. The only difference is that I'm honest about it. The words hit home with devastating accuracy. How many men had Jed killed in his 15 years as a bounty hunter? How many widows had he made? How many children left fatherless? He'd tried to tell himself it was justice, that he was serving the law and protecting the innocent. But in the quiet moments of his mountain exile, he'd begun to wonder if it had ever been about anything more than his own skill with a gun. Maybe you're right. Jed said quietly. Maybe I am a killer, but that doesn't mean I have to keep killing. Yes, it does. Caney's voice was certain, implacable. Because that's what we are. That's all we are. Everything else is just pretense. Behind him, Gracie stirred in the straw, her foal pressing close against her side. The little creature was awake now, her dark eyes wide and curious as she took in the strange scene before her. She didn't understand the violence in the air, the history between the two men, the years of blood and death that had led to this moment. All she knew was that she was warm, safe, and loved. Looking at her, Jed felt something shift inside him. Not the cold clarity of the wolf, but something warmer, stronger. The fierce protectiveness of a guardian, tempered by the wisdom that came from knowing the true cost of violence. You're wrong, he said, and his voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. We choose what we are. Every day, every moment we choose. Caney's expression flickered, just for an instant, as if something in Jed's voice had touched a nerve he'd thought was long dead. But the moment passed, and the pale eyes grew cold again. Pretty words, he said. But in the end, we both know how this has to finish. The wind outside was beginning to die down, the storm moving on to torment other mountains. Soon, dawn would break over the high country, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. It would be a beautiful morning, full of promise and new beginnings. But first, 2 old wolves would have to settle their account in blood. Jed took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his guns in his hands, the weight of his choices in his heart. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would define not just how he died, but how he lived. The thought of Mary Catherine, of Gracie and her unnamed foal, of all the small kindnesses he'd shown to wounded creatures over the past 3 years. He'd been the wolf of the territories once. But maybe, just maybe, he could choose to be something else. All right, Marcus, he said quietly. Let's finish it. The barn fell silent, except for the sound of breathing, human and animal, and the whisper of wind through the walls. Marcus Caney and Jedediah Boone faced each other across 10 feet of straw-scattered floor, their hands steady on their weapons, their eyes locked in the ancient dance of predators measuring each other. You know, Caney said conversationally, I always wondered what it would be like. The 2 fastest guns in the territories. No crowd, no distractions. Just skill against skill. Jed's response was to shift his weight slightly, a movement that put him between Caney and the others. Whatever happened, Mary Catherine and the animals would be protected by his body. It was a tactical disadvantage, but it felt right in a way that surprised him. Caney noticed the positioning and smiled. Still trying to be the hero, Jed? That's going to get you killed. Maybe, but it's who I choose to be. The words seemed to hang in the air between them. For just a moment, something flickered in Kane's pale eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. Or the ghost of the man he might have been before years of killing carved away everything soft in his soul. Choice, Caney said softly. Funny word. I used to think I had choices. Before Dodge City, before you made me look like a fool in front of half the territory, nobody made you look like anything, Jed replied. We both drew, we both missed. Could have happened to anyone, but it didn't happen to anyone. It happened to me. Caney's voice carried 15 years of bitter resentment. Do you know what it's like, being the man who couldn't outdraw Jed Boone? Having every 2-bit gunfighter in 3 territories think they could take you because of one moment of bad luck. Jed saw it then, the wound that had never healed, the pride that had festered into obsession. Marcus Caney hadn't come here to settle an old score. He'd come here to prove to himself that he was still the man he'd been before their first encounter. You've spent 3 years killing men who reminded you of me, Jed said with sudden understanding. Young guns, fast draws, anyone who might have heard the story. Caney's smile was cold as mountain ice. 17 men to be exact, all of them faster than they should have been, all of them unlucky enough to face the ghost of Colorado on the wrong day. The number hit Jed like a physical blow. 17 men dead because Marcus Caney couldn't accept that sometimes even the best miss their shots. 17 families destroyed by one man's wounded pride. They didn't deserve to die, Jed said quietly. Nobody deserves anything. We take what we can and kill what threatens us. That's the only law that matters out here. Mary Catherine's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You're wrong. There's another law, the one that says we protect what's innocent and good. Caney laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Innocence? Lady, there's no such thing. Just varying degrees of guilt and the illusion of virtue. As if to contradict him, Gracie's foal struggled to her feet, wobbling on uncertain legs as she took her first tentative steps. She moved away from her mother, drawn by some instinct toward the warmth of the oil lamp hanging from the barn wall. The little creature was fearless in the way that only the truly innocent could be, unaware of the violence that crackled in the air around her. Look at her, Mary Catherine said softly. Tell me there's no innocence in the world. For just a moment, Caney's gaze shifted to the foal. Something moved across his face, surprise perhaps, or the faint echo of wonder. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold mask he'd worn for so many years. Pretty, he said dismissively, but it won't stay that way. The world will corrupt it, break it, teach it that survival is all that matters. Just like it did to us. No, Jed said firmly. Not like us. We chose our path. We chose violence and death and the loneliness that comes with being feared. But she doesn't have to. She will. They all do eventually. Not if someone protects them. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just about an old grudge anymore, or wounded pride, or the settling of scores. This was about the choice between hope and despair, between the world as it was and the world as it could be. Caney's hands shifted on his pistols, and Jed felt the familiar tightening in his chest that meant violence was only heartbeats away. The moment of conversation was ending, replaced by the deadly silence that preceded gunfire. Time to choose, Jed, Caney said softly. The wolf of the territories, or the broken-down hermit who thinks he can save the world one wounded animal at a time. Jed's answer was to let his hands drop to his sides, fingers spread and ready. The old stance, the old readiness, but somehow different now. He wasn't drawing to kill, but to protect. The distinction might not matter to the outcome, but it mattered to him. I already chose, he said quietly. The wind outside had died to a whisper, and the first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the barn walls. In that grey half-light, two men prepared to settle a debt that had been 15 years in the making, while innocence slept peacefully in the straw between them. The moment stretched like eternity in the lamplight. Two masters of their craft, each reading the other's breathing, the set of shoulders, the tension in fingertips that hovered near gun leather. Jed could feel his heartbeat, steady and slow, despite the adrenaline singing in his veins. Across from him, Marcus Kane's pale eyes held the focused intensity of a man who had lived for this moment. The foal took another unsteady step, her small hooves clicking softly on the barn floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence, a reminder of life and innocence in a space thick with the promise of death. Caney's right hand twitched, the barest suggestion of movement, but Jed caught it. The dance was beginning. You know what I realized, tracking you all these months? Caney said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not retired. You're just afraid. Afraid that you've lost your edge. Afraid that the wolf isn't as fast as he used to be. Maybe I am, Jed replied, his own voice steady as stone. Maybe that's what happens when a man finds something worth protecting. Or maybe it's what happens when a killer tries to pretend he's something else. The insult hung in the air like gun smoke. Jed felt the familiar cold anger settling over him, the icy calm that had made him so deadly for so many years. But underneath it was something new. Not the berserker fury of a predator, but the focused determination of a guardian. Caney saw the change in his eyes and smiled. There he is! There's the wolf. Both men moved at the same instant. Jed's draw was pure muscle memory. 15 years of practice distilled into a motion faster than thought. His right-hand Colt cleared leather in a blur of steel and walnut, the barrel rising with mechanical precision toward his target. But Caney was just as fast, his own pistol appearing in his hand like magic. For a heartbeat they stood frozen, Two guns pointed at each other across 10 feet of space. Two men balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. The shots came simultaneously, twin thunderclaps that shook the barn walls and sent Gracie scrambling to her feet in terror. Smoke and flame filled the air, and for a moment neither man moved. Then Caney staggered, his left shoulder blooming red where Jed's bullet had found its mark. But his gun was still steady in his hand, and his pale eyes burned with undiminished fury. "Shoulder shot," he said through gritted teeth. "Getting soft in your old age, Jed?" Jed looked down at his own chest, where Caney's bullet had torn through his shirt and carved a shallow furrow across his ribs. Blood stained the fabric, but the wound was minor, painful but not fatal. They'd both aimed to wound, whether by design or instinct. "Maybe," Jed said. "Or maybe I'm just tired of killing." "Well, I'm not." Caney raised his gun again, but this time there was something desperate in his movement. The wound was weakening him, his hand not quite as steady as before. Jed could have put a bullet through his heart before he completed the motion, but instead he did something that surprised them both. He holstered his weapon. "What are you doing?" Caney demanded, his gun wavering between Jed and the floor, making a choice. Jed's hands hung loose at his sides, open and unthreatening. "Same choice I made 3 years ago when I came to these mountains. Same choice I make every morning when I feed the wounded creatures that find their way to my door. You're giving up? Just like that? I'm choosing not to be what you need me to be." Jed took a step forward, and Caney instinctively raised his gun. "You came here to prove you're still the man you were 15 years ago. But that man died in Dodge City, same as the wolf died in me. We're both different now, Marcus. The question is whether you can accept that." Caney's gun shook in his hand, the muzzle wavering between Jed's chest and the floor. "You don't get to just walk away. Not after what you cost me. I'm not walking away. I'm standing right here, giving you the choice. Pull that trigger and prove you're still the ghost of Colorado. Or put the gun down and prove you're something more." Behind them, Mary Catherine watched in breathless silence, her hand still gripping the pitchfork. Haskins had pressed himself so far into the corner that he seemed to be trying to merge with the barn wall. And in the straw beside them, Gracie's foal had found her courage again, nuzzling against her mother's neck as if seeking comfort. 17 men, Jed said quietly. 17 families destroyed because you couldn't let go of one moment in Dodge City. How many more before you're satisfied? How many more before you remember who you used to be? Something broke in Marcus Caney's face, a crack in the mask he'd worn for so many years. For just an instant, Jed saw the man he must have been before the killing started. Before the legend consumed the person underneath, the gun slipped from Kane's fingers and fell to the straw-covered floor with a soft thud. "I don't remember," Caney whispered, his voice thick with something that might have been tears. "I don't remember who I used to be." 3 weeks later, Jed sat on his porch with his morning coffee, watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. The storm had passed, taking with it the bitter cold of February and leaving behind the softer promise of early spring. Icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of running water as the creek began to thaw. The barn door opened, and Mary Catherine emerged, carrying a bucket of fresh milk from the goat she'd brought down from her ranch. Behind her came a smaller figure, Marcus Caney, his left arm still in a sling, but moving with purpose as he scattered feed for the chickens that had somehow found their way to the mountain sanctuary. It was a sight that would have seemed impossible a month ago. The ghost of Colorado doing farm chores, his pale eyes no longer cold, but simply tired, like a man waking from a long and troubled sleep. "Coffee's ready," Jed called, raising his weathered tin cup in greeting. Caney straightened slowly, favoring his wounded shoulder. The bullet had shattered bone, and Doc Morrison, Jake Morrison's brother who'd ridden up from town to tend the wound, had warned that he'd never have full use of the arm again. It was fitting in a way. The man who'd lived by the gun would spend the rest of his days reminded of what that life had cost him. "Thank you," Caney said, accepting a cup from Mary Catherine. His voice was different now, quieter, more thoughtful. The sharp edges had been worn away, leaving something that resembled humanity. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, three people who'd found an unexpected peace in the high country. Below them in the barn, Gracie grazed contentedly while her daughter, finally named Hope by unanimous consent, explored her expanding world with the fearless curiosity of the very young. Earl Haskins had left the mountain the day after the storm broke, riding down the trail with his head hung low and his expensive coat looking suddenly shabby in the morning light. But before he'd gone, he'd done something that surprised them all. He'd signed a document transferring any claim he might have had on Gracie and her foal to Mary Catherine, and another one deeding his land rights in the valley to a territorial trust for wounded animals. Doesn't make up for what I've done, he'd said simply, but maybe it's a start. Now Mary Catherine leaned back in her chair, her steel-grey hair catching the morning light. Heard from the marshal yesterday. They caught up with Jake Morrison trying to cross into Kansas. Found enough stolen livestock on his property to keep him in territorial prison for the next 20 years. Good, Jed said simply. Justice served, debts paid, the circle closing as it should. Caney was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the peaks. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. I keep thinking about those 17 men. Their families. How many children grew up without fathers because I couldn't let go of my pride? Can't change the past, Jed said gently. Can only choose what comes next, I know. It's just, how do you live with it? The knowing, I mean. How do you carry that weight without it crushing you? Jed considered the question, thinking of his own ghosts, the faces that visited him in the small hours when sleep wouldn't come. You find something worth protecting, something innocent and good, and you spend whatever time you have left making sure it stays that way. As if summoned by his words, Hope appeared in the barn doorway, her dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. She was growing fast, her legs longer and